Shkoyach. All right, so let's begin. Beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Mem Vav. I don't know what's going on here this morning. It's Ruach. Okay, good. So let's begin. So we left off. Is that what it is? Mamish. Was there a paraphrase last night? Yeah? Mamish. Okay, good. So let's go. So we left off the bottom of Mem Hamad Beis. The Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Huda, the Sharish Acharem Minale, which will say is 5 lines up from the bottom. I'm sorry. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Huda, the Sharish Acharem Minale. From where do we know this idea that you don't only destroy Avoda Zara, but you have to root it out. You have to root out after it, meaning you have to destroy it, but then you also have to dig down and try to uproot it. So the Gemara says, from the pasuk, you shall destroy its name from this place. The Rabbanan used that pasuk to teach you that you have to go ahead and call Avoda Zara by a nickname. What does that mean? Rabbi Elazar says, so where do you know after you destroy Avoda Zara that you have to go ahead and root it out? Talmud Lomar v'ibaratem es shemam. So the pasuk says, you shall destroy its name. It will say top of Memvav Amud Aleph. Amud Rabbi Akiva, fellow Kavar Ne'emar Abei Tabdun. So here Rabbi Akiva says, but the pasuk already says, you shall surely destroy. Imkein ma Talmud Lomar v'ibaratem es shemam min ha'makamohu. But if the pasuk already says that you have to destroy Avoda Zara, then what? Why does it say v'ibaratem es shemam? Why does it say that you have to destroy its name? So the Gemara says, Hahu lechanos l'shem. But say this ultimately teaches me that I should give. It literally means give Avoda Zara a nickname, which I will say ultimately means what? Go ahead and call Avoda Zara by a different name. So the Gemara says, Yachol lechanos la, Yachol l'shvach. I might have thought maybe I should call Avoda Zara by a nice name. L'shvach a nice name. Ela Yachol lo l'shvach v'lo l'gnai. Rather, what it means is I might have thought that just I could call it by any name, not necessarily a nice name, not necessarily a derogatory name. Talmud Lomar Shakeiz Tishaktenu V'Ta'ev Tisa'avenu Ki Cheremhu. Therefore, we'll say the pasuk says literally Shakeiz Tishaktenu. You should treat it like a sheketz, right? Like a creepy, crawly thing. Treat it like something disgusting, because Avoda Zara is off limits to you. HaKetzad. So we'll say what it means is the goal is to call Avoda Zara by a derogatory name. Ketzad. So the Gemara says, what's an example of that? Hayu Komen Osa Beis Galya. If they call the Avoda Zara Beis Galya, we'll say now Galya. Rashi says over here is Lashon Gova Gali, right? It means Beis Galya means high, like a pile, like a tower. So if they used to call the Avoda Zara Beis Galya, you should call it Koren Osa Beis Karya. We'll say call it Karya. We'll say Karya means like a quarry, like you dig something. So if they called it something high, you call it something low. Ein Kol. If they called the Avoda Zara the all-seeing eye, you call it Ein Kotes. Let's call it thorn in the eye. The idea being that I will say it's not just enough not to worship Avoda Zara, that's obvious, but one has to place a distance in themselves in Avoda Zara to whatever degree possible. One of the greatest ways in which we place a distance in ourselves in Avoda Zara is to disparage it, to actively disparage the Avoda Zara. Tani Tana Kamed Rav Sheshes. Ha'akum hold. So we'll say. So first of all, there are just two important yisodas that are coming out over here. Yisod number one is this idea that it's not just enough to destroy Avoda Zara, but zarach lahashrish achareha. You have to root it out. You have to dig down and literally dig out the roots. Dig out the roots means that remove any vestige of the Avoda Zara itself, and anything deeper associated with it as well. And number two, the idea that if the Avoda Zara is known by a particularly praiseworthy name, you have to call it by something a little bit more disparaging. Tani Tani Kamed Rav Sheshes. Ha'akum ha'ovdim es ha'arim v'es ha'gvos. If an akum goes ahead and worships the mountain and the hills, hein mutard. So as we saw in yesterday's daf from the day before, so the hills and the mountains remain mutter because the akum can't turn the hill or the mountain into a chefetz of Avoda Zara. Va'ovdehen b'sayif. But those who worship it ultimately are killed by the sword. In other words, they're of the Avoda Zara. So meaning, we'll say this is an interesting idea. The Chavamina is, I might have thought that since the Oved Avoda Zara can't transform the object he is worshipping into a chefetz of Avoda Zara, so what? So maybe that means that what? That he's not chayav for Avoda Zara either, for worshipping Avoda Zara. Kamash Mala, no. even though he can't go ahead and turn the hill or the mountain into Avoda Zara, nevertheless, what? He is still chayiv for Avoda Zara. So the Gemara says, if he worships the seeds or the vegetables, he worships that as Avoda Zara, Heinas involved in B'sayif. Then I will say, ultimately, again, those could be transformed into a cheftza of Avoda Zara because they're movable property, they're metaltalin, so they could be turned into Avoda Zara, they become Asar, v'ovdei and B'sayif. And the person who worshipped it ultimately is executed worshipping Avoda Zara. Amarle, the Amar Lecha, Mani, who said this to you? Meaning, whose opinion is this? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi bar Yehudihi, the Amar, Ilan Shenatu Ulebasov Avdu Asar. We'll say, whose opinion is this? This reflects the opinion of Rabbi Yossi who holds. We saw this in yesterday's daf, that if you take a tree, and the tree initially was planted, not for Avodah Zarah purposes, for stamp purposes, and what happens afterwards, you serve it, that it becomes asr. That ultimately the tree afterwards becomes asr. So we'll say, so v'lokma b'hilan shenatu mitchil l'kach v'rabanan. But why not set up the discussion before as dealing with the case as a tree which was originally planted for Avodah Zarah and is asr in accordance to the Rabbanon? Lo, sagadaitcha diktani dum yedahar. No, because we will say the case has to be comparable to the mountain. How so? Mahar shelo natu mitchil l'kach. Just as a mountain was not, so to speak, originally planted or created for the sake of Avodah Zarah, so too, I will say the second case in the Brisa also has to be something that wasn't originally created for Avodah Zarah. Therefore, again, it resembles the case of the tree initially planted for the sake of a tree and subsequently worshipped. So we'll say, let's just close the loop on that because we had that machlokas yesterday between the Tanakh and Rabbi Yossi Aglili regarding a tree which was planted for the purposes, which was planted for no purposes, just planted for stam, right, nondescript arboreal purposes, just to be a tree, and then it was subsequently worshipped. So does that subsequent worship turn that tree into a cheftza of Avodah Zarah? Rabbanon said no. Rabbi Yossi Haglili said yes. How do we paskin? We paskin like the Rabbanon, Rabbi say, that a tree could only become a cheftza of Avodah Zarah if ultimately planted for that purpose initially, but not if it's planted stam and then subsequently worshipped. So the Gemara goes weiter. Itmar. Then we're going to begin in discussion. It's going to take us a little bit of time, but it's really quite fascinating. Itmar. Avne harshin daldulu. What's the case here? If you look at Rashi, Rashi says it's the first short line in Rashi. Shin daldulu. So we'll say this is a case ultimately again, you have stones on a mountain. Shenedaldlu, Rashi says nikru me'elehem means they were uprooted by themselves. So we'll say what we established earlier was what? Was that Lamaisa, if you go ahead, Akum worships a mountain, he obviously does not transform that mountain into a cheftza of Avodah Zarah. Right? What happens if there were stones dislodged on the mountain? And what happens? Those stones remained on the mountain. They were not dislodged by man, but rather they were just stam dislodged. So now we'll say those are movable stones, but they still sit on the mountain. The Ovid Kochavim worship them. So what's the shaila? Do the stones become Avodah Zarah or not? That's the fundamental shaila. Now, on one hand, they're still sitting, kind of attached to the mountain, but yet they are physically detached from the mountain. So if the Ovid Kochavim worships them, do they become Avodah Zarah or not? Bnei Rabbi Chia of Rabbi Yochanan, supposed to say this is a machlokes between the sons of Rabbi Chia, who, interestingly enough, Rashi points out are Yehuda and Chizkiah. Those were the names of the son of Rabbi Chia. So Yehuda and Chizkiah, Bnei Rabbi Chia, Chadamar and Rabbi Yochanan, Chadamar Asuros. One said that the stones are in fact Asr, V'chad Amar Mutaros, and one said that they are Mutar. So the Gemara says, "My taima demand Amar de Mutaros." What's the logic, Rabbi say, to say that the stones don't become Avodah Zarah? That ultimately, again, they're still Mutar because ultimately, again, the stones will be just like a mountain. Mahar she'in bo tfisas yedei adam umutar. Just like the mountain, ultimately, again, is not. Remember, in bo tfisas yedei adam we saw in yesterday's daf means that what? They were never manipulated by a person. In other words, they're not created. There's no human involvement in their creation. So to say these stones, right? A person was never involved in them. Remember, even though they're detached from the mountain, how did they become How did they become detached from the mountain?
On their own.
On their own, right? It has nothing to do with me. Nothing to do with me. Therefore, again, halacha lemaisa, they should be mutter. Umalahar shekemu chuber. Umalahar shekemu chuber. But I will say, on the other hand, the mountain is attached to the ground. These stones are not. To which the Gemara says, you're right, behema tochiach. So at the end of the day, says the Gemara behema tochiach. We can learn this out from the case of the animal. We'll say, what's the pshat with the animal? Take a look at Rashi. Actually, not yet. Yeah, fine. Take a look at Rashi. Behema tochiach. We'll say, take a look. It's on top of Rashi, the second of the short lines. Behema tochiach. Sheina mechuber. We'll say an animal obviously is not attached to the ground. Ve'in on the aseres b'ishtachaviyah. This is actually very interesting. And the animal itself does not become aser if somebody worships it. Dimida aser rachmana ne'evad legavoa dechsiv min abakar v'lo kol abakar lohotzia ne'evad. So we'll say the fact that ultimately what? The fact that halacha l'maisa, a cow becomes aser legavoa for sacrificial purposes, if it's worshipped, tells us that that's only the gavoa. The Rashi over here quotes the drasha mechlal de lahedyot shari. For stam purposes, I will say if somebody worships a cow, right? So ultimately, again, I could go ahead and use that for non-sacrificial purposes. So the Gemara says mechlal de lahedyot shari. De lahedyot aser lama likra legavoa. Fine. So back to the Gemara. So behema tochiach. Mala behema, but no, you can't prove it from behema. Why? Shekein balas chaim. So we'll say ultimately again a behema is a living thing. So who's to say you could bring a raya from the behema ultimately about the stones? To which the Gemara says hariochiach. Fine, we'll go back and we'll prove it from the mountain. Problem is you can't prove from the mountain. Why? Because as we just said before, the mountain is mechuber. The chazra din lori zekrizeh for lori zekrizeh. So we'll say it comes out that they're not all comparable. Zat sad hashava shebahen. What is the common denominator? She'ein bahen tfisas yedei adam umutter. We'll say the common denominator seems to be that these are all things for which there is no human involvement, and therefore, again, what? They are mutter. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the bottom line common denominator, specifically focusing over here on the mountain and the stones which became dislodged from the mountain, is that there is no tefisas yedei adam. There is no human involvement. So because there is no human involvement, ultimately, again, they cannot become aser through Avoda Zara. So the Gemara says as follows: Af kol she'in bahen tefisas yedei adam mutter. So I asked the Gemara, Mala tzara shava shebahen shekin lo nishtanim mibriyasam. Why don't you say that actually the tzad hashava, that the common denominator is that these items have never changed from the time that they were created? Ela asya mi behema ba'alas mum. So says the Gemara, you're right, but you could bring a raya from an animal which now has a mum. So we'll say umehar, and from the mountain. So we'll say the case of the behema ba'alas mum ultimately again is an entity which has changed since its creation. V'inami mi behema tama umi ilan yavesh. Or I will say ultimately again, you can bring the raya from a behema tama, which is an unblemished animal, and an ilan yavesh, a dry tree. But say, so even though a dry tree has changed, nevertheless, what? It does not become avodah zara. To which the Gemara goes right and says, "Uman da asar lahachi ksev." So we'll say, so far, we've seen the svara ultimately of the one who says that it's mutter, right? We've seen the svara of the one who says that it's mutter. That halacha lemaisa, if the stones become detached from the mountain, that they're still considered to be part of the mountain, so to speak, and cannot become aser through avodah zara. So we'll say, in the logic being, just the basic svara seems to be lefi she'in bahen tfisas yedei adam. Because it was said there's been no human involvement with this. So because there's no human involvement, pretty much it's the equivalent of the mountain, even though it's now detached from the mountain. So the Gemara says, Uman da asar. So we'll say, what about the opinion who says that the stones will be asar, the detached stones which are resting on the mountain will be asar? Lahachi ksiv shakif tishaktzenu v'ta'iv tesa'avenu. Da'af agav da'asim in dina lehetira. So we'll say, the Torah uses very strong lashon here, right? The Torah uses lashon of shakhet tishaktzenu v'ta'iv tesa'avenu, which means we'll say avodah zarah should be something that is disgusting and repulsive to you, which teaches me, we'll say, that even if you can prove that something may be halachically permissible, nevertheless one should endeavor to stay away from it. So even if one can make a compelling argument that these stones might be mutter, l'mais again one should distance themselves from it. Tistayim debnei Rabbi Chia desharu. We'll say it would appear that it is. Now remember again, the Gemara quotes this machlokes about the stones, right? Avnei harshne dalglu, and tells us that the sons of Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yochanan had a machlokes at mutter aser. The problem, not the problem, but the Gemara did not tell us who holds what. So the Gemara now says it would appear that it was the sons of Rabbi Chia, ultimately again, who said that the stones were permitted. Why? So listen to this interesting case. Zakov beitza l'ishtachavos la'mahu. We'll say if you stood up an egg, right? If you stood up an egg, right? Stood up an egg, you stood up an egg, right? And for the purpose, ultimately, again, to bow down to it, as Avoda Zara. So what's the halacha? We'll say, what's the status of the egg? So we'll say, first wide line, mem vav amud aleph. Says the Gemara, so I'm at the so what that means is I stood the egg up to bow down to it, and what? I bowed down to it. The kami barile, and I will say the fundamental shaila is, hai ziki fasa, ihavi maisa, ilo havi maisa. And I will say the fundamental shaila is, right, is the act of standing up the egg considered to be a maisa or not? Avalo zakaf, but like what I can infer from that is, that avalo zakaf, but if I did not stand up the egg, lo misra, ultimately again, the egg does not become aser. Now we'll say, why does the egg not become aser? Lefi she'in bat tfisas yidei adam, because there's no human involvement over there. And that's why, again, at the end of the day, it will not be aser. Shma mina, b'nei Rabbi Chia d'shara. And the fact that b'nei Rabbi Chia apparently say by the egg case, that if you just leave the egg stam and you bow down to it, the egg doesn't become aser. The only shaila is if you stand it up. If you stand it up and were to go ahead, ultimately again, would it become aser? Now, we'll say, what's the difference between standing it up or leaving it alone? So, because the act of standing it up is an act of human involvement. So, because of that, ultimately again, has the capacity to be aser. So, you see from here that Bnei Rabbi Chia are the ones who say that where there is no tefisas yidei adam, ultimately again, so therefore the object doesn't become aser. Applying that logic before, in the case of avnei harshin edaldalu, the case of the stones on the mountain, which becomes dislodged but remain on the mountain, Bnei Rabbi Chia apparently would say that what? That it remains mutter. To which the Gemara says, Olam eimu lacha Bnei Rabbi Chia da'asri. That's not true. I could still say that Bnei Rabbi Chia are the ones who say that the stones which became dislodged become aser. Dishtachav Allah, afal gav delo zakfa asura. Because they will say they might hold that a case of where you bow down to the egg, even though you didn't stand it up, it still becomes aser. So what's the case over here with the egg? We'll say, what's the case? The case is where someone stood up the egg to go ahead and bow down to it, bless you. But he didn't, but no one ended up bowing down to it. So the Gemara says, Ulaman, Ilaman de Amar Avodas Kocham Yisrael Asura Miyad Asura. So we'll say, I don't understand. What's the case? The case is where somebody stood up the egg to worship it, but no one actually ended up worshiping it. So I don't understand how this would be us. Let's analyze this. So if you hold according to the opinion who says that the Avoda Zara of the Yisrael becomes immediately aser even before it's worshipped. Once it's designated as Avoda Zara, by definition it's Avoda Zara, it's aser. So then asura, then I will say obviously the egg will be aser. Ilaman da Amar ad she is aved. So I will say, but if you say, but according to the opinion it says that the Avoda Zara of Yisrael only becomes aser when? Only when it's worshipped. So says the Gemara, Halo Polcha, no one ever bowed down or davened to this egg. He goes, what's the case? I will say, he goes, Shezakav Beitz Lishtachavo. So listen to this. Somebody stood up the egg to go ahead and worship it. Velo Ishtachavela. And the Jew never did so. But what did happen? Uba Ovid Kochavim Vishtachavela. But Ovid Kochavim came along and worshipped the egg. Kihada Amr Yehuda Amr Shmuel. Yisrael Shezakav Levina Lishtachavela. So listen to this. It's actually fascinating. So now a Jew stood up the egg. Akum came along and bowed down to it. So we'll say, so what's going on over here? We'll say this is like a previous case we learned. That if a Jew stood up a brick, suppose I stood a brick up so that it's standing height-wise, it's standing tall. What happens? And I did in order to worship it. I'm worshiping the brick. And the Akum came along and worshipped the brick. Asura. Ultimately, again, the Akum's worship of the brick that was stood up by a Jew. I know my English is not that was stood up. Yeah, okay, that was stood up by a Jew. So it says the Gemara Asura, the Kami. I'm sorry. Stand it up. Oh, that sounds much more. It's much more Hamish. Studied. I think studied. Studied is even better. Studied. Right? So says the Gemara. So Asura. The Kairais will say, what's the Shaila? The Kamibaile, Leveinu Hutim Inkara Zekifta. So we'll say, I might have thought as follows. That is dafka in the case of the brick, where when you stand it up, I will say, that is an obvious maisa. Why? Because when the brick stands in its height, right, obviously that's much more recognizable than when it's laying down across its width or across its length. Aval beitza lo, but an egg, when you stand it up, is not such a recognizable maisa. Ol dilma loshna. Or maybe it makes no difference ultimately again between the brick and the egg. The idea over here is that when you do some kind of maisa and the akum comes along and what? The akum worships it, that by definition ultimately again it turns and it makes it asur. So says the Gemara Teku. So the Gemara ultimately again leaves the case of the egg, right? The brick case is clear that if a Jew stands up the brick, the akum goes ahead and worships it, so the brick ultimately becomes asur. The case of the egg, the Gemara seems to say, is a teku. The fundamental shaila being rooted is the act of standing up the egg a significant maisa or not? Okay. Boy Rami Barchama. Hamishtacha lahar. So we'll say if somebody bows down to a mountain. So we've already established that if you worship, a person worships Avoda Zara, a mountain has Avoda Zara. What's the status of the mountain? What's the status of the mountain? Unchanged. Right? Unchanged. You cannot change the status of a mountain through Avoda Zara. Right? Again, for all the reasons that we discussed. However, Avanov Mahul Mizbech. Let's listen to this interesting shaila. If you go ahead and you chisel some stones from that mountain, so ultimately again, can those stones be used to go ahead and build a Mizbeach? Build an altar. So we'll say Amadeus. What's the shaila? Yesh ne'evad b'mechuber itzel gavoa, o ein ne'evad b'mechuber itzel gavoa. We'll say, what's the fundamental shaila? So do we say, remember again, if something was worshipped for Avodah Zara, we'll say, you can't go ahead and use it for any type of temple purpose, right? Legavoa. So the shaila Rabbi will say is if something was worshipped, but it was mechuber, so obviously I know I can't go ahead and turn that object into Avodah Zara. The shaila is it now off limits for the use of sacrificial purposes or not? So the Gemara says, Yesh ne'evad b'mechuber eitzel gavoa, o ein ne'evad b'mechuber eitzel gavoa. If imtim salomar, yesh ne'evad b'mechuber eitzel gavoa. And I will say, if you hold, actually I will say, just go for 1 second, go back to Amud Aleph just for a moment. Last Rashi on the daf. The last Rashi on Amud Aleph is actually Shayach to Amud Beis. Rashi is ne'evad the ba'ali chayim asur legavoa. Remember again, in the case of an animal, if you worship an animal, a person worships an animal for the sake of Avodah Zara, that animal becomes asura as a carbon. You can't offer it up on the Mizbeach. The afagav the shari lehedyot. Interestingly enough, you could use that for mundane purposes. I could eat the animal, I could check the animal, but at the end of the day, I can't give it as an offering. The afagav the shari lehedyot. The kami baile mi chayil shem ne'evad ala mechuber la'osra la'gavalo. See here the fundamental shayla. Here's what I know. I know is that if a person worships the mountain, they don't transform the mountain into a chefetz of Avodah Zara. That's what I know. What's the shaila? The shaila is if a person goes in and worships the mountain as Avodah Zara, and someone then takes stones from that mountain, can those stones be used can those stones be used in the service of the Beis Hamikdash? That's the fundamental shaila. So that's yesh ne'evad legavoa b'mechuber etzel gavoa oein ne'evad b'mechuber etzel gavoa. So listen to this. Imtim salomar yesh ne'evad b'mechuber etzel gavoa. So we'll say, if you want to say that l'maisa again, yes, it is asur. It is asur. You can't take that which is attached to the ground and worship as avodah zara, even though it doesn't become avodah zara. You can't use it for sacrificial purposes. So if you do hold that, machshirei karban ke karban damu olo. We'll say, what about a secondary usage? Look at Rashi. Tap Rashi memvam days. Eitzel gava. Ivimtim slamar yesh ne'evad eitzel gava. Akatimi baile hachi. Hay ne'evad the lavlo carbon gufei kabaile. Ela lebinyan mizbeach. The machshirei karban mi'amrini ke karban dami. V'ne'evad aser ban alo. We'll listen to this. What about to take stones from the mizbeach, from the mountain, to make a mizbeach? So we'll say this was what we'll call machshirei karban. That's not the actual sacrifice itself. Rather, what that's called it's a machshir. It's a secondary usage. So machshiri carbon ke carbon dami olo. Amar Rava. Suppose say Rava tries to solve this with the following kal v'chomer. Listen to this. Uma esnan shemuter b'talosh lehedyot aser b'mechuber legavoa. So listen to this. You hear the fundamental shaila. The fundamental shaila is as follows. We really have two simultaneous questions happening over here. Number one. Ultimately, again, do we say yesh ne'evad b'mechuber eitzel gavoa, that if something ultimately again is attached to the ground and therefore cannot be transformed into a chefza of avodah zara, will it still be aser for sacrificial use? That's question number one. And then the corollary, the follow-up question on that is, even if you say that that is aser, what about use of that object, not for direct carbonic purposes, but what? For secondary carbonic purposes, machshiri carbon. What's an example of machshiri carbon, Rabosai? Building a mizbeach. So can I use the stones from that mountain, which was worshipped as idolatry, to go ahead and build my mizbeach? So we'll say, so watch this. So it says the Gemara, Rava wants to bring a kal v'chomer. Uma esnan, Rava say esnan means a payment given to a harlot, right? A payment given to a zona for her services. It says the Gemara, Uma esnan shemuter betalish lehedyot. Now watch this. So let's say a person pays the esnan. Now, let's say he pays her betalish. He gives her a watch. So we'll say, what's the halacha? That watch, somebody else could use that watch. Let's say she gives that watch to somebody else. So we'll say, so the Maisa again, that watch is not Asr Ba'ana, right? The Hedyot could use that watch. But we'll say Hedyot just means any unconsecrated use. So Asr B'Mechuber L'Gavoa, yet I will say, if somebody gave her something that is Mechuber, right? Gave her a house, whatever it is, gave her something that's Mechuber. So we'll say that item is Asr L'Gavoa. The Beis HaMikdash, that item cannot be used by the Beis HaMikdash. D'chsiv lo savi esnan zona umechir kelev, because it will say ultimately again the pasuk says you shall not bring the esnan zona, the payment of the zona, ultimately to the Beis Hamikdash. Who's in the Beis Hamikdash? Lo shna talosh v'lo shna mechuber. Makes no difference if the esnan Rabosai is attached to the ground or detached from the ground. Ne'evad sha'aser b'talosh lehedyot. So we'll say when it comes to ne'evad, remember ne'evad means something worshipped for avodah, something worshipped as avodah zara. Sha'aser b'talosh. We'll say that object again, if it's detached from the ground, then what? It becomes aser. Remember again, detached avodah zara is the paradigmatic case of avodah zara. Right? It's detached. It becomes ne'evad. Sha'aser b'talosh lehedyot. So we'll say avodah zara, which when it is detached becomes aser for anything, even lehedyot, meaning even for unconsecrated purposes, it just becomes aser b'anda. Eino din sha'aser b'mechuber legavoa. We'll say ultimately, so then the kal v'chomer dictates based on esnan zona that it should become aser legavoa, that b'mechuber, that even ultimately again, even if it's mechuber, I will say, even though again if the avodah zara is mechuber, ultimately it doesn't become aser lehedyot, because avodah zara, which is mechuber, I will say, can't really be transformed to a chefetz of avodah zara, but it should still be aser legavoa to the Beis Hamikdash. Armali Rafuna B'Rei Rav Yeshua l'Rava. So this was Rava's kal v'chomer. And based on Rava's kal v'chomer, Rabosai, ultimately again, even something that is mechuber, even though it can't be transformed into a chefza of avodah zara, will still be off limits to the Beis Hamikdash. Based on what? Based on a kal v'chomer to esnan, payment to the zona. Esnan of zona when it is talush, ultimately again is, or whether it's talush or mechuber, ultimately again is mutter to the hedyot, but yet is going to be aser legavoa. So certainly again avodah zara, which is aser to a hedyot when it is talush, will certainly be aser to gavoa when it is mechuber. Amrali Rav Huna Yeshua l'Rava. So Rav Huna Yeshua says to Rava, ochiluf. Or by the way, you could turn that kal v'chomer on its head. How so? Uman ne'evad sha'aser b'talush eitzel hedyot mutter b'mechuber legavoa. Well, you can say as follows. Ne'evad, something worshipped as avodah zara bosai, is going to be aser legavoa when it is detached. Yet again, eitzel hedyot mutter begavoa. Right? Eitzel hedyot mutter b'mechuber. So also listen to this. Yet ultimately again, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Ochiluf. Uma ne'evad sha'aser b'talosh eitzel hedyot. Yet mutter b'mechuber legavoa. So also listen to this. I could have said as follows, that when it comes to neva, something worshipped as avodah zara, when it is talush, when it is detached, it is aser, even by a hedyot, even by regular circumstances, maybe would be mutter b'mechuber legavoa. Shneimar Eloheim al haharim v'lo haharim Eloheim. Lo shna lehedyot v'lo shna legavoa. But say ultimately, what does the Torah teach me? The Torah teaches me that something that is attached to the ground can never become, can never become Avoda Zara. And I can make the argument that perhaps that is true for Hedyot as well as Gavoa. 1 second. Esnan, shemuter betalosh lehedyot, eino din shemuter b'mechuber legavoa. Then Rabbi say, remember again, now comes along Rav Yeshua and flips the Kavachomer on its head. He's starting with Avodah Zara, and then learning the Kal V'chomer back to Esnan. Esnan shemuter b'talush lahedyot. So we'll say in Esnan, when it's talush, when it's detached, ultimately is muter to a hedyot. Ein odin shemuter b'mechuber legavoa. Ultimately, again, should certainly be muter. Should be muter b'mechuber to the Beis Hamikdash. V'im yishum Beis Hashem Elokecha. And if you want to say ultimately, what about the pasuk of Beis Hashem Elokecha? So you will say, now remember what the Gemara is suggesting over here is that if the Esnan goes ahead and receives something that is mechuber, something that is attached to the ground, she, according to this Kal V'chomer, she can give that to the Beis Hamikdash. What you're going to ask, but the pasuk says Beis Hashem Elokecha. So I'll say the pasuk says Lo Savi Esnan Zono Mechir Kelev Beis Hashem Elokecha. Now remember again, before we use that phrase Beis Hashem Elokecha to teach you that even if she receives something mechuber, that cannot be given to the Beis Hamikdash. So what are you going to do with that phrase? I will say that phrase is necessary to teach you the following halacha. Beis Hashem Elokecha, when it says that she can't bring her esnan to the house of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, prat lepara she'ina ba'a lebayis tivir Rebbe Lazar. Well, this is actually quite interesting. Let's say the zona receives as her payment a para aduma. So from client, right. So what happens? So she goes here, she gets a para aduma. So we'll say now, what's the shaila? The shaila is, can she go ahead and bring that para aduma? Can she give that para aduma to the Beis Hamikdash? It's the fundamental shaila. So the Gemara says, so Beis Hamikdash prat lepara she'ina ba lebayis. The Rebbe Lazar. So we'll listen to this. The pasuk says anything that esnan is given as payment for her services, lo savi Beis Hashem Elokecha, cannot be brought into the house of God. So it says the Gemara. Lo savi esnan zona mechir kela Beis Hashem. So let's listen to this. Rabbi Lazar has an incredible drasha. Rabbi Lazar says this doesn't include para aduma. Why doesn't it include para aduma? Because we'll say, interestingly enough, para aduma is not offered up in the Beis Hamikdash. Right? The para itself is not a carbon that is offered in the Beis Hamikdash. So because of that, remember again, para aduma, we'll say, is shechted on harazesim. Right? You can go. It's actually today. It's a monastery. The spot where they know the spot where they shechted the carbon Pesach. They don't have to carbon Pesach. You see the paraduma. It's mamish right across in the Harabais. It's the non-cemetery part of Harazesim. So it says the Gemara. I should say it differently. It overlooks the valley of Harazesim. So it says the Gemara. So prat la parashena ba l'direbet lebais. So we'll say ultimately again. So that comes to exclude the only thing an Esnan can't bring. Ultimately, is anything that's going to be offered up in the Beis Hamikdash, but the paradum which is offered outside the Beis Hamikdash, even if it was given to the zone as payment for her services, can be brought. The Chachamim say l'rabos es harikuim. The Chachamim say that this comes to include what? That if she got paid in gold plating, she can't donate that gold plating to the Beis Hamikdash. They both say in the Kodesh Kadashim, the walls were gold plated. So if an Eslan was paid in gold plating, she cannot donate that plating to the Beis Hamikdash because again, I both say that's Losavi Eslan Zona Beis Hashem Elokecha. Since it's going to be used for the actual construction of the house of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you can't use it. So we'll say Rava responds back to Rav Huna Rabbi Yeshua. Ana ka'amina l'chumra va'at amrit l'kula. I don't understand you. I brought down a kal v'chomer, and my kal v'chomer yielded a chumra, and your kal v'chomer yielded a kula. Kula v'chumra l'chumra parchinon. Whenever we have two possibilities, two ways to learn a kal v'chomer, and one is the kula, one is the chumra, we always go the chumra by the kal v'chomer. So I'm Rav Papa says to Rava, is that true? Is that true? Wherever we have the ability to learn a kal v'chomer, the kula or the chumra, that we always learn the kal v'chomer, the chumra, v'ha hazod the Pesach. But what about the following case of say? The case of sprinkling on Pesach. What's the case of sprinkling on Pesach? Look at Rashi for just a moment. It's almost, we'll say, it's such a treat. Right across in Rashi. Just mamish, shift your eyes to the left. Hazod the Pesach, Tame Meis, Shechal Shvi'i Shalo Lihios B'Shabbos B'Ara Pesach. Well, this is a really interesting case. So you have a following situation. Somebody was Tame Meis. So someone said the only way, remember again, to rectify that Tumah is how? is paraduma, but it turns out that, so remember again, you're sprinkled with the ashes of the paraduma on day 1, day 7. So what happens? So it turns out that day number 7 is also Shabbos. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? So the pligi, so v'ha azad the Pesach, the pligi Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva. The Rabbi Eliezer Zara l'chumra, the kamechayiv le'legavra. Rabbi Eliezer says, we'll say l'chumra. He learns out the kavachomer. Rashi will point out the kavachomer in just a moment. He learns it at l'chumra, right? And I will say again, his logic is, Rabbi Eliezer's logic is that if you could shecht the Karban Pesach and on Shabbos and shchita is a malacha, so we'll say certainly you could sprinkle on Karban on Shabbos. So we'll say, what's the issue with hazah on Shabbos? It's a shvus, it's a din d'Rabbanan, it's usher. We'll say, why would it be technically usher to go ahead and sprinkle the paraduma ashes on Pesach? Because we'll say it resembles malacha. Why does it resemble malacha? Tikkun mana. You're fixing something. In this case, you're fixing the ritual state of a person, and therefore it's asim d'Rabbanan. We'll say isim d'Rabbanan is called a shvus. So Rabbi Eliezer says that lemaisa again. Rabbi Eliezer Savar l'chumra. V'kamechayv le'gavra. Rabbi Eliezer says, "Kavachomer is if you're allowed to do shchita, which is a real malacha, then what? You certainly could do hazah, which is only a shvus." Rabbi Akiva l'kula. But yeah, Rabbi Akiva says no. Even though again you could go ahead and do shchita, he doesn't permit you to violate the shvus. So it says the Gemara. I will say, so the kula means that lamais again, which means you can't go ahead and do the sprinkling, and therefore by definition the individual is exempted. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Rabbi Eliezer, Dan kavachomer l'chumra diktani am Rabbi Eliezer va'alani dan amashchita shimishum malacha doches haShabbos zu shemishum shvus inodin shetitcha v'yazala v'yischai b'Pesach. So we'll say that's Rabbi Eliezer's kavachomer. If you could do shchita, then what? You certainly could do hazah. Rabbi Akiva parach lekula upater me Pesach diktani. So we'll listen to this. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, learns lekula, namely that you can't go ahead and do the hazah. But we'll say now, by the way, if you can't do the hazah, then what else can't you do? Karban Pesach. V'kaparach Rabbi Akiva lekula. We'll say ultimately Rabbi Akiva learns out the kavachomer lekula, and yet what? We go ahead and we seemingly pass like him. Rashi says, "Oh chiluf." I'm reading the rest of that Rashi. Mahazod mishum shvus eno dochas hashabbos shchita mishum malacha huadin eno she'eno titcha alva kam l'chomer lekula parach. So also Rabbi Akiva's kavachomer is like this: if you can't do hazah, you certainly can't do shchita either, and therefore again, Karban Pesach is not dochas Shabbos. To which the Gemara says, "This nan." Heishiv Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva answered up Rabbi Eliezer. Oh chiluf, you can flip the kavachomer around. Uma hazah shimishum shvus enodoches haShabbos. If sprinkling the water of the paradum on a person, which is a shvus asim d'Rabbanan, is not doches Shabbos. Shchita shidoraisa l'kol shekein. Then I will say, certainly all the more so shchita is not doches Shabbos as well. So I will say, you see from here that what? That when you have a kavachomer that can be learned one of two ways. One l'kula, one l'chumra. You can learn it l'kula as well. Remember again, the kula over here is that what? The kula over here is, according to Rabbi Akiva at least, it sounds like you're not offering Karban Pesach. So that is a kula, because at the end of you are being exempted from an obligation. To which the Gemara says, no. Hasam Rabbi Eliezer Gamrei. I also ultimately, again, in this case, there was something deeper happening over here, which is Rabbi Akiva was not really trying to go ahead and prove that you should be exempt from Karban Pesach, but rather, again, Rabbi Akiva was trying to jog the memory of his Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer had taught Rabbi Akiva this sugya, v'iyayker le Talmuda, and Rabbi Eliezer had forgotten that which he had taught. Va'asa Rabbi Akiva la'adkure, and Rabbi Akiva was there to remind his Rabbi, ultimately again about what he had taught. V'hainu da'amar le Rabbi, al tach bireni b'shas hadin. And that's what we'll say part of this discussion where as they're having this exchange, Rashi points out that this was part of a larger exchange, but as they're having their exchange, Rabbi Akiva says to Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi, al tach bireni b'shas hadin. Rabbi, please, do not go ahead and deny what I'm saying at the time when we're duking this out, right? At the time when we're deciding on the din. Kach mekubal ani mimcha. Rabbi, I learned from you, hazah shvus, sprinkling of the ashes of the paradum rabosai, sprinkling in general is a shvus, is an isur midrabanan, ve'ena docha es haShabbos, and a shvus rabosai is not docha Shabbos. Interestingly enough, as much as a Shabbos can be docha, a da'oraisa, but ultimately again the shvus is not docha Shabbos. So I will say the idea that the Gemara is saying over here is the way the Gemara seems to be ending off is that lemaisa when you have the ability to darshan kavachomer, one way goes l'chumra, one way goes l'kula. it appears that generally we will take the approach of the Chumrah when it comes to interpreting the Kal V'chomer. And therefore, I will say, ultimately, again, learning this back, it would appear, based on that Kal V'chomer, that even though if you worship the mountain, so ultimately, again, the stones of the mountain do not become Asr, but nevertheless, if you were to take those stones, you would not be permitted to take those stones and ultimately use them to construct the Mizbeach. We'll stop over here, share with you a short idea on the parasha. So also we know in Parshas Kisisa we have the incredible and overwhelming episode of the Cheta Egel, the sin of the golden calf. So after the sin of the golden calf, Moshe Rabbeinu was able to effect tshuva on behalf of the klal, on behalf of the people, and he goes up to get the second set of luchos. So chiyuv davens today. There is a chiyuv. Good. It says a yard. Oh, yard good. Good. So the Gemara says, so Moshe Rabbeinu goes up to the mountain, and ultimately again goes ahead and gets the second set of luchos. So the pasuk when Moshe Rabbeinu goes up, Perek Lamed Daled pasuk Gimel, the pasuk says, "V'ish lo ya'al le'imach." So no one else can go up with you. V'gam ish al yira b'chol hahar, gamatzon v'habakar al yiru el mula harahu. So we'll say ultimately again, remember, Chodesh Baruch Hu gives Moshe Rabbeinu very specific and explicit instructions. No one should go up with you, right? No one should be seen by the mountain. Even the animals should not graze by the mountain. So we'll say the great tzaddik Rabbi Shmuel Silber, the Rishner, has a beautiful and exceptional insight into this pasuk. He says, what does it mean? V'ish lo ya'al le'imach. No one should go up with you. So listen to the words of the Rishner. V'ish misha machzik es atzmo li'ishius li'yesh malei gaiva v'esnasus lo ya'al le'imach. We'll say the Rishner says that if a person holds himself out to be an ish, right? A person is egocentric, a person is self-centered, a person makes their life all about themselves, lo ya'al le'imach. It's impossible to have an aliyah. It's impossible to go up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's impossible to ascend the mountain of growth and self-actualization. Sometimes, again, if a person is too focused on the ish, a person is too focused on the I, a person is too focused on themselves, lo ya'al le'imach. It's impossible for a person to experience an aliyah. Kadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, ultimately, if you want to ascend the mountain, not just this mountain, but every single mountain in life, you have to learn how to go ahead and keep your ish in check. You have to have a healthy sense of self, Rabbosai, but life can't just be about me. Life can't be about the service of the ish, the service of the I. So the shayla is, how do we accomplish this? How do we go ahead and kind of check the ish, check the I, check the ego, so that we're able to be makayim ya'al le'imach, we're able to ascend the mountain, and ultimately go ahead and self-actualize. So we'll say, because it's Shushan Purim, so we could still say, not Purim Torah, but ultimately Torah from Purim. So I came across a very beautiful idea. Actually, I was thinking about saying it over yesterday, but it was something else. So there's an incredible ma'aseh that's told about the Beis Avram of Slonim, the Slonim Rebbe. And the Hasidim, of course, would come to him on Purim, bring him a beautiful mishloach manos. And there was one particular person who brought the Rebbe a magnificent mishloach manos. And the Rebbe said to him, it was a big fruit platter. So the Rebbe said to the Chassid, thank you so much for the incredible fruit platter, but there's something even more that I'd like from you. He said, can you give me a shtickle hearts? Can you give me a little bit of your heart? I appreciate the fruit, but can you give me a little bit of your heart? He says, what's the pshat? What does that mean? And the Rebbe, the Beis Avram, says something so beautiful. He says in the Megillah, it says, Umishloach manos ish l're'ehu. Mishloach manos ish l're'ehu. So the Rebbe dashed this pasuk in such a beautiful way. But say, ultimately, again, what's the greatest shalach manos that you can give to someone? Ish l're'ehu. If you give of yourself, not of your food. Of course, there's a mitzvah to give, but if you give the beautiful mishloach manos you can give someone, Rabbi Osai, is ish. You give some of your ishiyos, you give some of yourself, you give a little bit of yourself to someone else. That's the most beautiful shalach manos. So yesterday we learned about the pashat tehent. Today we're learning about the shtickle hearts, right? To be able to give a little bit of yourself, a little bit of your heart to another person. That's about say the greatest mishloach manos. Mishloach manos, ish l're'ehu. And that's the pshat perhaps in the Rishner as well. that lo ya'ale v'ish lo ya'ale imach. See, Rabbi say, the incredible part about Purim is that we mamish spend an entire day focusing on other people, right? Focusing on other people, whether it's shalach manas, whether it's suda, whether a person is zochet to have a family, whatever it is, it's an entire day that's mamish devoted to the other. And if your Purim was not fully devoted to the other, then you need a do-over. You have to do it again, the Shushan Purim, right? You have to. I will say, but that's the pshat. The problem in life is sometimes when life becomes about me, right? When life becomes about my happiness, life becomes about my success, life becomes about my dreams, my ass, oh me, then the problem is lo ya'ale imach. You can't descend the mountain like that. But let's say a successful life is a life where, of course, I have my dreams, I have my aspirations, I have my goals, but it has to be a devotion to the other. It has to be not just on Purim, but every day, mishloach manos ish l're'ehu. I have to give some of my ishios for others, not just to focus on myself, but to find a way to give to the other, to serve the other, to devote myself to the other. And if Rabbosai, we're able to focus a little bit less on ourselves and take our kochos, take our abilities, and use them to help the other, then in Meretz Hashem we will be zocha to the ya'ale imach. We will be zocha Meretz Hashem to climb our mountains, to ascend our mountains, and to enjoy a beautiful devekus with the Ribono Shalom.